So the public emergence earlier this spring of 12 Shiite militias fighting alongside Syrian government forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad, coupled with the public announcements of Lebanese Hizbullah, the Party of God, so-called Party of God, the political party, paramilitary organization, that it was publicly, during the Battle of Qusayr in May and June of this year, that it was publicly admitting that it was active in Syria, has brought the increasing sectarianization of Syria's civil war to the forefront. It is becoming an increasingly significant feature of this conflict and is being utilized both by the Syrian government and its various sort of myriad opponents, among them the anti-government rebel groups and political opposition groups as well, though more by the armed groups. The social processes of sectarianization in Syria today are not, as is often claimed, not only in the media but also by some commentators on regional affairs, primarily or mostly to do with these ancient, quote-unquote, ancient animosities between Sunni and Shi'ite Muslims, that this is something which has been going on for 1400 years, and this is just the latest incarnation of it. We had it, in 2003 to 2000, ongoing in Iraq, and then this is the latest incarnation of these ancient animosities between Sunnis and Shiites. Now, there's an element of, there's a historical rivalry, there's historical debates, of course, between Sunni and Shiite Muslims about theology, about leadership of the community, about, very interpretation of history. I'm not negating that, but it's not the only thing which is at play here. What I argue today is that while it is certainly true that historical differences, some of them major, exist between Sunnis and Shiites with regard to the reading of Islamic history and theological beliefs, as I said, contemporary conflicts between different various Sunni and Shiite communities have as much to do, if not more, to do actually with political and sort of local economic even dynamics and conflicts, competition, as they do with competing interpretations of theology, history, this kind of thing. And if we go outside of Syria, away from even the Arab world, we can go to Orakzai agency, which is one of the tribal agencies in northern Pakistan. There are Sunni and Shiite Pashtun tribes now who have become embroiled in a very sort of violent on-again, off-again sectarian infighting. But if we look, there's been some research on this conflict and looked at the economic and class issues involved. So the Shiite tribes tended to be landed. Even in other parts of Pakistan, they tended to be notable families, and the Sunni, so there's an element of sort of class struggle and social economic struggle going on at the same time. And then as the conflict has continued, layers have been added in terms of using sectarian rhetoric, religious differentiation, to fuel the conflict. But it's important, I think, to note that there are these other things which are going on. So today I'm going to discuss the political aspects of sectarianism among the various actors in Syria, with a particular focus on the foreign fighter Shi'i militias operating in the country, the genealogy of sectarianism in the most extreme rebel groups, that of Jabhat al-Nusra, and also the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Ash-Sham, which has sort of two manifestations, one in Iraq and one in various sort of local forms in Syria, particularly in northern and eastern Syria. We'll also talk about the visual culture and the rhetoric of sectarian mobilizations in the Syrian conflict. I'll pay close attention to the historical and cultural significance of the mobilization frames, so references to history, idioms, cultural idioms, these kinds of things, which are used in the hopes of inspiring broad public support for these various armed groups, social mobilizations. So keeping the images in mind, just to talk a bit about the politics of sectarianism. Sectarianism has long been a tool used for social and political mobilization by a variety of actors, and historically has been used as much in intracommunal struggles as in struggles between communities. So historically, sectarianism has been driven by the politics and competitions over group identity, social processes which have been harnessed to mobilize large numbers of people against other groups. This remains true today as conflicts break down along sectarian and ethnic lines. Identifiers such as religious affiliation, ethnic group, language, come to or used as a tool with which to differentiate one group against a rival group. So historically, ruling powers, as I think is quite well known, in various regions, not just in the Arab world, but in Africa and in parts of the subcontinent, in East Asia, Southeast Asia, have been you have used minority groups and recruited among them for local kind of forces. So the French did this during the Mandate period post World War I, among the Druze, the Alawis, and even among the Kurds in Syria, in the Levant, in sort of Syria, Lebanon, as to form sort of their local forces. The minorities were more willing to work with the French because they had more to gain, whereas the majority Sunni Arab community was less likely, less inclined to work with them because more likely, also it was a way for the French to resist pan-Arabism because in the case of the Kurds, they're not Arabs, and in other cases, the minorities did not feel that pan-Arabism represented necessarily something that would be beneficial to their community. And in a little bit, I'll talk about a similar case in India with regard to pan-Muslim sentiments and how recent research has shown that Indian Shiites, particularly in northern India, there was a lot of doubt about this pan-Muslim movement of Aligarh and the founding of the Aligarh University in India as a tool, it means of fighting the British, that it represented all Muslims, that it wasn't something that represented Shiites necessarily, and so that there was actually some resistance to it and disagreements among various Shiite sort of groups and factions within northern India. So today sectarianism is being used as a political tool for mobilizing support for particular strategic agendas. Iran, the Iranian government, for example, which is the Syrian government's chief regional ally in the Middle East, is currently actively trying to sway Shiite public opinion toward viewing the conflict in black and white terms. What I mean by that is Iranian government officials and sort of state-connected media outlets or quasi-state, connected media outlets, including Press TV, Fars News Agency, things like this, the Ahl al-Bayt News Agency, as well as Hizbullah and other groups which are allied to Iran sort of regionally, have been portraying the conflict in black and white terms in the sense of all of the rebels are painted as the same. They're all basically painted as being akin to Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, the two most extreme in terms of ideology and tactics, among the rebel sort of coalition or loose coalition. The rebels at the same time are also portrayed sort of ironically as being in league with the neo-imperial powers, which is how in the discourse, sort of Iranian state discourse, Hezbollah's discourse, and the discourse of various Iraqi Shiite parties, which have been actively recruiting fighters to send to Syria, the United States, the European Union, Israel, that the rebels are basically just a tool of neo-imperialism, and therefore this is another reason to resist them. Another argument, which is somewhat, we can find parallels to actually in our own country, not that long ago, is this idea of why are we fighting them? We're fighting extremists there, so we don't have to fight them at home. This is verbatim actually something that Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, in May, during, after when he announced that his party, Hezbollah, was actively involved militarily on the ground in Qusayr over this battle, over this strategic key city, alongside Syrian government forces. He also said, well, why are we there? Like, what is the purpose of Hezbollah being there? Well, we're there because we're fighting extremists, and therefore, and if we don't fight them there, that they will come to Lebanon, which of course is divided among, I believe it's 18 different sects, and has been sort of constantly in danger of sort of reigniting, because when the civil war ended in 1990-91, with the Taif Accord, they basically reified the same system which had collapsed previously. So this was his argument. We're fighting extremists there in Syria, so we don't have to fight them at home. There's a growing Salafi movement, including a militant faction among the Salafis, which we saw, I believe, in July actually, I think, with Ahmed al-Asir, this charismatic sort of Lebanese Salafi preacher based around Tripoli, the northern city of Tripoli, this sort of beautiful coastal town in northern Lebanon, sort of toward the Turkish border. And he's in hiding now. I think the last I heard, he was in a Palestinian camp somewhere in Lebanon. So in his recent groundbreaking study of the Indian Twelver Shiite community in the United Provinces, the former United Provinces in British India, which is basically in the present-day provinces or governorates of Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand in northern India, around the city of Lucknow, Justin Jones, a British scholar, describes the internal dynamics of sectarianism among the Shiite community of northern India in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, far from being solely an externally focused process based on Sunni Shiite interactions only, The sectarianization of large numbers of northern India's Shiites and Sunnis also involved internal dynamics such as competition over communal leadership among within the communities themselves, between different Sunni leaders and different Shiite leaders with each other, as well as the competition over juridical authority between Sunni and Shiite jurists within their respective communities. And by jurists, I'm talking about those who are the mujtahidun, the mujtahids, those who are have been deemed capable because of their education by their teachers of exercising a kind of independent juridical reasoning. So looking at the sources and then coming up with basically juridical opinions. That's, I think, a good Cliff Notes kind of version of that. Younger scholars within both the Sunni and the Shiite communities in the United Provinces found in sectarianism a useful tool with which to contest the authority of older generations of scholars. So whereas the older generations of scholars were more interested in finding a rapprochement when there was a break between the Sunni and Shiite communities in northern India. The younger scholars were not as interested in doing this because many of them on both the Sunni and the Shiite side were not well known before a particular series of events which Jones calls the Tabarra agitation, and which took place basically from the mid-1930s to 1939. They were not known before that, but through this Tabarra agitation, they were able to achieve a much greater degree of communal authority. And the Tabarra agitation basically it refers to this practice of Tabarra, which is kind of ritual cursing, which Shiites do toward various Sunni leaders, historical leaders, particularly the first two caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar. They curse them in this kind of thing called tabarra, and there's a long kind of history to that, which we don't have really time to go into today. But basically, Sunnis revere Abu Bakr and Omar, and Shiites do not. In fact, Shiites see Omar in particular as being historically connected to an event in which the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, Fatima az-Zahra, was mortally wounded and martyred. Some of them consider that she was martyred. And then Omar was one of the individuals who was involved in this event, which they call the event of Fadak. So in response to, as Indian Shiites began to have a distinct identity that we're not just a Muslim minority within a Hindu, a non-Muslim majority, we're also a minority within a minority. So we are not just Muslim, we are Shiite Muslims. And this pan Muslim sentiment, which was growing in India at the time, with the founding of Aligarh University and other kinds of social networks, groups, and parties, did not necessarily represent the Shiite community, because a lot of the rhetoric and idioms which are used, and even the interpretation of history, is very Sunni. So they felt that it excluded them, and many of them resisted it and didn't see a place for Shiites in it. So in response, a number of the Shiites began to publicly recite Tabarra, either after Friday prayers or during the Muharram processions which mark the martyrdom of the third Shi'i Imam, Hussein. They would publicly, almost like a performative kind of act, they would perform this Tabarra, this ritual cursing. In response, some Sunnis said, well, if you're going to do that, then we demand that we are allowed to hold public processions, mass public processions in praise of the first two caliphs, right? So they pressured their politicians, they pressured the Congress Party, the fledgling Congress Party, to allow them to do this. There was a lot of political wrangling, and eventually they were allowed to do this. And not only that, but the recitation of the Tabarra by the Shiites was outlawed. And many Shiites in opposition to this, they publicly did it, knowing thousands, tens of thousands of them did this in public, sometimes on the steps of public buildings, knowing that they would probably be arrested. At night, they would recite Tabarra from the rooftops, this kind of tit-for-tat kind of process. And in a bit, I'll just talk about the sectarianism as a process within individual communities which reifies itself. So basically, it runs parallel in one community, in this case the Sunnis and the Shiites. It plays off one another, and it increases and increases. And this is true then, and it can be seen, I would argue, as well in Syria today. Now, competition came to a head in 1938 and 1939, when thousands of Shiites, as I said, courted arrest by publicly performing the ritual cursing in response to the growing Sunni movement for the holding of processions in praise of Abu Bakr and Omar, the first two Sunni caliphs. Attempts in 1939 to negotiate an end to this communal strife between Sunni and Shiite communal leaders was actually thwarted by internal competition among the Shiites. So when one Shiite group or one leader would be close to reaching a kind of deal for rapprochement with Sunni counterparts, another Shiite group would interfere and basically disrupt the process. And this happened sort of repeatedly over that year in sort of this internal intra-Shiite communal competition over authority. And I would argue there's a possibility, and I need to look into it more, and it's something that my dissertation will in part focus on, is whether there's something similar going on with regards to the recruitment of Shiite fighters, from Iraq primarily going to Syria. And why I say that is because in Iraq there is a broad current, we call it a current or a trend, the Sadrist of the Sadrists, basically. So who are the Sadrists? Well, many of us have probably, many of you have probably heard of Muqtada Sadr, and by the Sadr's current, I'm referring to all of those groups, personalities, sort of communal leaders who claim to represent the legacy of Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, who was a mujtahid, a Shiite jurist, who was assassinated in February of 1999 by the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein outside of Najaf, the city of Najaf, along with two of his sons, Mustafa and Mu'amal. He was born in March 1943 in Najaf into a prominent scholarly family. The al-Sadr family is a very famous, illustrious sort of Shiite family. Originally, I think they are from Jabal Amil in southern Lebanon, but a branch of the family moved to Iraq, and then another branch of the family moved to Iran. So those of you who are familiar with Lebanon are probably familiar with the name of Musa al-Sadr. He is a cousin of Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr. So Sadiq al-Sadr, he studied in the seminary, the Shiite seminary system, the Hawza, with his cousin, another famous mujtahid, an activist mujtahid named Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. So those familiar with Shiism will know this name. I mean, he was a prolific writer. He too was executed by the Ba'ath Party in 1980 along with his sister, Amina bint al-Huda. So Sadiq al-Sadr studied with him. He studied with a variety of other prominent Shiite mujtahids of his age, including Abul Qasim al-Khoy and Muhsin al-Hakim, who during his lifetime, al-Hakim was considered perhaps the most senior of the Shiite sort of grand mujtahids, the Maraja al-Taqlid, the grand ayatollahs during his lifetime. He's an Iraqi, but originally his family is from Iran, way back when. Sadiq al-Sadr's rise to prominence begins in the late 1990s, in 97, 98. He takes over, he starts holding public Friday prayer at the Great Mosque in Kufa, the city of Kufa, which is also home to one of the shrines, the shrine of Abbas, actually, of al-Abbas. This is important because the position on Friday prayer is it's different. So Sunnis are required, generally speaking, to go to Friday prayer. There are certain conditions when they don't have to go that are not important for the discussion now, but male Sunnis are expected to go to Friday prayer. There's really not a reason that you should miss it. Shiites, however, the juridical position is somewhat different. Again, and it has to do with sort of reading of history and leadership of the community. They're not required to go. As far as I know, the sort of consensus now today, I know that Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani's position is that it's not absolutely required to go to Friday prayer, but it's better that if one goes to it. But it's not an absolute requirement. So Friday prayer before Sadiq al-Sadr began holding them in the mosque in Kufa were not common. Not just for religious or juridical reasons, but also because of the repression by the Iraqi, the Ba'athist government in Iraq. And by mass demonstrations, you can still find some of the videos, rough, sort of, not the best quality videos from this period. And by mass public prayers, I'm talking tens to scores of thousands of people in and outside the Great Mosque in Kufa. And he used it, and his sort of rivals and his competitors among the Shiite jurists accused him of many things. During his lifetime, they accused him of being Saddam's mujtahid, in part because Saddam tried to basically woo him and say, look, you're an Arab, you're an Iraqi, and these people are Iranians, and so, if you would work with me, then, I'll let you, sign certificates for Shiites to travel, to abroad, for people to come and study under your, in your seminary, things like this. Sadiq al-Sadr ultimately, didn't go along with this, which then resulted in his assassination, literally in like a drive-by shooting, in 1999. So what happened after his death, particularly sort of post-2003, the US and British-led invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq, was that a number of movements who claimed to represent his legacy, including that of his son, Muqtada, who is head of the mainstream Sadr movement, the Tayyar Sadr, so literally the Sadr movement, claimed his mantle. Basically, we represent his Sadaqa Sadr's true legacy. Muqtada Sadr, however, did not have monopoly over his father's legacy for very long. By 2003, so even later in 2003, 2004, different groups began to break away, some of whom are important and active in Iraq. Among these are, including Muqtada, the mainstream Sadr movement under Muqtada, there are a number of different sort of militias and parties, a number of them supported by the Iranian government. One of them is called al-Asad al-Haq, the sort of League of the Righteous, or the People of Truth, which is a paramilitary organization which is closely aligned with the Iranian government. It's also now sort of an Iraqi, not a political party per se, but it's a social movement. If you look at any of their literature, if we were to go to their website now, you will see a picture of their leader, whose name is Qais al-Khazali, as well as Muhammad Sadaqa Sadr, I think on the left of the kind of banner of their current website. So there are groups such as this, and there are a number of sort of messianist or quasi-messianist figures. Mahmoud Sarhi al-Hassani is one, Muhammad al-Yaqubi, both of whom claim to be grand ayatollahs, so grand mujtahids, as well as Qasim, this individual a man named Qasim al-Ta'i, who is interesting because he has been closely involved with he's been one of the most public sort of Shiite juridical voices, Iraqi Shiite juridical voices supporting the mobilization of Shiite militias in Syria. So he visited the shrine of Sayyida Zainab on the outskirts of Damascus earlier this spring, where he met with militiamen and held teaching circles with them. There are videos of some of this, and posed for photographs with them in the shrine's courtyard with these kind of religious banners. He also opened a representative office, a wakil office for himself in the Sayyida Zainab district in December. At least the video of the opening dates from December of last year. This came at a time when many other Shiites and also non-Shiites were fleeing the district because of increased fighting. At this time, he opens an office. What this suggests to me is that he sees this as an opportunity through which to. I had never heard of him before, even as a mujtahid. I mean, there are a number in Iran and Iraq of people who've claimed kind of, ijtihad, this kind of scholarly authority in modern periods where in the past people would have laughed at them and not paid them any attention. In Iraq, some of them are called the engineer mujtahids because we look at their background in the 1990s and the 1980s. They received various kinds of engineering degrees from Baghdad University. Then in the 1990s, God spoke to them or something, and they said, "Oh, we have to go. We want to enter the seminary." They enter the seminary, and then they come out with, we have the certificate of ijtihad. Well, who gave it to you? Well, that's not important, but we have it. So they're called, some of them are called the engineer mujtahids, kind of as this kind of derogatory way of referring to them. Ata'i is one of these. He claims to have been a very sort of close student of Sadaqa Sadr. After Sadaqa Sadr is assassinated, he claims then he studied with Sistani and with Muhammad Ishaq Fayyad, who was another one of the sort of four resident Grand Ayatollahs in Najaf. So it's possible that an internal Iraqi dynamic is at play, particularly given the mainstream Sadr movement's kind of ambiguous positions regarding, well, should people be going to fight in Syria? Well, and then that's about, it's not clear what the position is. Muqtada has at various times said he opposes it, but it still seems to be going on. His image is used sometimes, but not often. So what I'm going to look into sort of in my dissertation is basically whether there's this internal kind of intra-Sadrist kind of competition, in some ways similar to what Jones talks about in northern India, at play with regard to the mobilization of militias in Syria. So that's the time. Okay. So I talked a little bit about the sectarianization of the different sides involved in the Syrian conflict. It's mutually reinforcing, so it plays off each other with processes of sectarianization running parallel to one another. From the Syrian government's reliance on the Alawi minority, of course, in the country's, in the military and the paramilitary sort of apparatus of the state, as well as its alliance with Hizbullah, the Shiite Hizbullah and other Shiite Iraqi militias. The use of Shiite iconography, idioms, and the more stringently anti-Shiite rhetoric of some of the rebel groups, the more extreme ones particularly, have played off one another and fueled the kind of increasing levels of sectarianization of the conflict. Efforts by opponents of the Syrian opposition and rebel groups have been aided in their media operations by the destruction or the desecration of some Shiite shrines or tombs inside them, or the tombs inside them rather, by some rebel groups, particularly those that are more Salafi leaning. Chief among them was the shrine of Hujr bin Adi al-Kindi, who was a key supporter of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first Shiite Imam, who's also recognized as the fourth caliph by the Sunnis. The shrine was largely destroyed in early May by one rebel group, Liwa al-Islam, the Brigade of Islam. His tomb was disinterred and his body was taken away, because Salafis, as many of you may know, are very iconoclastic in this way. They see that visitation of shrines, graves, cemeteries as being a form of shirk, a form of polytheism, un-Islamic kind of behavior. So they took his body away and hid it. And then in a month later, or in May rather, so 2 months later, the shrine of Amr bin Yasir, which is this massive shrine complex in Al-Raqqa, in sort of northern Syria, which was built by the Iranian government in a very kind of ostentatious, the construction of the mosque itself, the mosque shrine complex, was very controversial. Local tribes, Bedouin tribes, were not happy about it. It's not, it's very Central Asian in its architecture, the characteristic blue turquoise, and the kind of, but not from the Levant. So there was opposition. It doesn't really match the area that it's in. There was opposition during its construction, and the Syrian and the Iranian government said, well, we don't really care about that. We're going to build it. At least his grave, the same thing. He was disinterred, and his body was reportedly taken and hidden somewhere away. So the Shiite militias, for example, who are operating in Syria, have used these kinds of events and highlighted them constantly, highlighted them in order to say, look, we told you that the rebels do this, and look, they do it. They've destroyed the shrine. They're shelling the shrine of Sayyida Zainab in southern outskirts of Damascus. There was damage to the shrine of Sakina, the daughter of Imam Hussein. And they circulate these pictures online and in news media as well, and television news, and saying, look, we told you that these groups were like this, and look, this is what they do. And also as well as highlighting the assassination of some sort of key Shiite communal leaders in the Sayyida Zainab area, including the rector Nasr al-Alawi of the Zainabiyya Hawza seminary in Sayyida Zainab sort of district. So the public emergence of the sort of Hizbullah and Shiite militias in Syria then led to an increasingly vitriolic sectarian rhetoric on the part of some Sunni actors. Sort of most famous of these would be Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the kind of television mufti of Al Jazeera, who lives in Qatar. He still is, I believe, a sort of strong supporter of the government of former President Mohammed Morsi in Egypt. In fact, he said that before Morsi was ousted and the Muslim Brotherhood was ousted, he said that protesting against them was akin to khuruj an wali al-amr, so rebelling against the ruler, which in Sunni Islam is not permissible. So he has had this kind of on and off again position toward Shiites. I suspect that he was not as ecumenical as he portrayed himself sort of earlier on. And he began to turn, though, sort of to be very sort of anti-Shiite in 2003, following this kind of farcical, televised execution of Saddam Hussein. So he gave a sermon after Hussein was executed in this kind of spectacle by people chanting Muqtada Sadr's name, and he said, not only should they not have executed him on the Eid, the Sunni Eid, but the festival ending, I think it was Ramadan, but they should have not executed him because, and he makes this argument that Saddam Hussein was reformed and he built mosques and this kind of thing, and he prayed, and I mean, so if you go and find the sermon, this is what the argument he makes. But so Qaradawi, openly called for Sunni Muslims to go to Syria and fight in jihad. He uses the term jihad, this very sort of key juridical term of jihad. Those who are, there are also the Salafis in various countries, such as Muhammad al-Arifi in Saudi Arabia, who has a long history of anti-Shiite kind of rhetoric, which long predates the conflict in Syria, the uprising in Syria. So in 2010, for example, he called Sistani, Grand Ayatollah Sistani, an infidel, among other things. But then we see also sectarianization among groups which historically do not have a strong sort of anti-Shiite animus, including the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Sort of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Egypt, Hassan al-Banna, and then sort of even key ideologues, some of them very radical, like Sayyid Qutb, who's well known because as being one of the, even in sort of our media now, as being kind of one of the godfathers of jihad, I think people have called him, which is problematic, but it's a topic for another day. They didn't really speak about Shiites. They have nothing, because there are really not that many Shiites in Egypt during their lifetime. They have nothing to say about them. The Syrian Brotherhood is different, but what we saw though in the months before the military ouster of Morsi's government, coup, not a coup, maybe it was a coup, was a representative, a key presidential aide saying, oh, if Egyptians are thinking of going to Syria, you can go because we're not going to prosecute you when you come back. And some elements of the Brotherhood were even more sort of blunt and said you should go and fight jihad against the Safavids, the Shiites, the Safavids in Syria. So moving over to just the rebel sectarianisms, and then I'll close with talking about the Shiite kind of sectarian rhetoric and visuals. This is an example of the Shiite sort of side of this. The two most extreme groups that are rebel groups, Sunni rebel groups, which are operating in Syria now. One is Jabhat al-Nusra. The full name is Jabhat al-Nusra li Ahl al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, the support front basically for Jabhat al-Nusra li Ahl al-Sham, so the support front for the people of Asham, of the Levant or of Syria, and the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, which is the main sort of ISIS faction is based in Iraq. It used to call itself the Islamic State of Iraq. Basically, it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's an umbrella organization which is dominated by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS on the ground in Syria, they collaborate in some areas, but they do seem to be two distinct organizations. Both of them, Jabhat al-Nusra, and when we go back to the slides sort of having to do with them, I'll point out the flag. It's a little different than this flag. They do use this flag as well, but their main flag is slightly different. It has the Shahada, the two testaments of faith, that there is no God but the one God, and Muhammad is his messenger. And then it has the name of the group, Jabhat al-Nusra, on the bottom. But if you look at, even in their videos and other kinds of materials, at their rallies, people carry this flag as well. Whereas the ISIS flag is just this straight, just this, only this flag. There's no other kind of, a variation of it is they have, Ad-Dawlat al-Islamiyya fil Iraq wal Sham on the bottom, which is so they add it to this sort of this design. So these are the two most extreme groups among the rebels who are, in terms of their sectarian rhetoric, and they have a genealogy. The genealogy of their sectarianism, it makes their anti-Shiite animus not that surprising. So basically, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, what became Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was founded by a Jordanian, a sort of infamous Jordanian, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who in 2003 founded an organization which he called the Group of Absolute Monotheism and Struggle, Jama'at al-Tawheed wal-Jihad, just before the American invasion, kind of in Kurdistan. And I believe, actually, if I recall correctly, that this was one of the reasons given, of Saddam's support for militants, was that Zarqawi was in Iraq, and he was in Iraq, but he was in Kurdistan, sort of in the north, where the Saddam, he was guilty of many things, did not control Kurdistan. After the Americans and the British and other sort of coalition countries invade, Jamaat al-Tawheed al-Jihad carries out, became very infamous for carrying out these grisly, videotape beheadings. Some of them carried out by Zarqawi himself, Nicholas Berg, and then kind of these horrific kinds of sort of pornography of violence was actually a term that I got from Professor Hamdani way back when. But it is a kind of pornography, this kind of performative violence for its own sake, right? Without any, there is some kind of semblance of explanation of, well, we're doing this because, but then there is this kind of, well, we're going to show you in grisly detail with zooming in the camera what it is we're doing. So this is what Zarqawi became most known for. His followers even would later call him, as an honorific, the Sheikh of the Slaughterers, as well as the Prince of the Martyrs, which is a sort of gross term for him. But so he was killed in 2006, and later that year, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it actually morphed into Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004, late 2004. Zarqawi gave bay'ah, or declared his fealty, at least symbolically, to Osama bin Laden, the head of the original al-Qaeda organization, which is sometimes called al-Qaeda Central. And he's killed in a bombing, US bombing on his safe house in June 2006. In October of 2006, the al-Qaeda and the al-Qaeda organization in the land of the two rivers, al-Qaeda in Iraq, changes its name to the Islamic State of Iraq, adopts this flag. The previous al-Qaeda in Iraq flag is slightly different. The logo is different. They adopt this flag. They form a ministry. They form ministries. So basically, even though they reject the modern nation state, they design a bureaucracy, if you will, along the lines of a nation state. They have a minister of oil, a minister of media, a minister of war. The only thing that is slightly different is they have a Sharia council as well. So the Zarqawi was extremely anti-Shiite. His sort of rhetoric about the Shiites was extremely, he was very unambiguous. He called them the lurking snake. In this letter, sort of rambling letter to Ayman al-Zawahiri in 2005, they're the lurking snake who are, poised to stab the Muslims, the Sunni, which for him would be the Sunni Muslims in the back. And we need to. This is why I'm targeting them, because Zawahiri and other, in Bin Laden even, another al-Qaeda leaders had said, look, you can't just blow up markets indiscriminately and sort of behead people and execute people indiscriminately, because it's bad PR. Because people in Indonesia don't really understand why, sort of the nuances of what you're saying. Okay, they're Shiite, but their name is Ali, and we don't understand why you're killing them. So you should stop doing this. And Zarqawi, there was this back and forth sort of over that year, 2005, 2006. He said, mind your own business, I'm going to keep doing it. And he wrote this letter to Zawahiri, which was intercepted, I forget if it was by the Kurds or maybe by the US, a long letter in which he talks about his plan for the Iraqi Shiites, the Iraqi Kurds, the Iraqi Sunnis, what is his plan for them. So this is the genealogy of Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham. The Islamic State of Iraq and only recently did it change its name and add Syria to its name in sort of May, I believe, of this year. Was actively involved in the founding of Jabhat al-Nusra in January, sort of early 2012, late 2011. So this is why I say it's unsurprising that this kind of virulent sectarianism by Jabhat al-Nusra and by the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham is not that surprising. What is more remarkable, however, is the sort of gradual and its sort of continuing adoption of sectarian rhetoric among other groups of Sunnis who previously have not had, or at least have not publicly espoused, this kind of anti-Shiite sort of sectarian animus. So there are, there's some militias that fall under the Free Syrian Army umbrella, which have begun to use more sectarian terms to describe Shiites, and I'll just describe some of them just in a moment, as well as some more mainstream kind of, public, popular religious figures like Osama al-Rafai, who in a June 6th sort of video message during the Battle of Qusair, which was titled "The Letter to the Mujahideen in Qusair and Syria," said basically that they should, encourage them to fight the Majus. The Majus are the Magians, the pre-Islamic kind of fire worshippers of pre-Islamic Iran, because we'll get into that in a moment. And then also, he also called the Shiites the Safavid infidels, as-Safawiyun al-Kafara. So some of this language, which is very weighted historical language, sectarian language, which some Sunnis use about Shiites. This include the Majus, the Magians, these sort of basically Zoroastrians or pre-Islamic fire worshippers, because the arguments by Salafis, for example, Salafi Sunnis, is that Shiites are not Muslims. They are in fact non-Muslims, but they're also in a way more dangerous than Muslims because they pretend to be Muslims, and they're basically pre-Islamic Iranian religion, so they call them Majus. They call them Rafida or Rawafid, the plural, rejectionists, those who reject true Islam, quote unquote true Islam, that would be Sunni Islam. They call them Safavids, which is a reference to the dynasty that ruled Iran from 1501, the date 1722, 1736, which oversaw the gradual conversion of Iran to become from a majority Sunni country to a majority Shia country. So they call them Safavids. So the Safavid, in Islamic State of Iraq videos about the Iraqi government, they don't say, al-Hukumat al-Iraqiyya, they say al-Hukumat al-Safawiyya, right? And this is a rhetoric which has been adopted by Jabhat al-Nusra and the Syrian branch or the Syrian groups that operate under the Islamic State of Iraq's banner. So this is the language, and so it's more, I think, remarkable to see, and important to, and significant rather, to see how this kind of language has crept into sort of groups which just, previously didn't use it. Sort of just to close before going to the images and talking about them a little bit more, and then going to Q&A. So media reports of Shiite militias and foreign fighters, and I'm talking other than Hizbullah, Lebanese Hizbullah, operating alongside Syrian government forces, began to surface regularly in sort of the second half of 2012. Various reporting by Reuters and the AFP, for example, with anonymous Iraqi government officials, including officials within the powerful Shiite parties like the Bashar organization and the Supreme Islamic Iraqi Council. Anonymous sources confirmed to reporters that there was recruiting going on, sort of in Shiite, where there were provinces in Iraq where there was a strong Shiite minority, in Diyala, or mixed population rather, not a minority. At the same time, on YouTube and other sort of video sharing sites, videos of purporting to show fighters active in Syria, Shiite fighters, militiamen active in Syria, began to pop up on YouTube. Some of them are still up, and this is discounting videos that may have been put up earlier and then taken down either by YouTube rather as a violation of service, or by the user themselves, because this does happen. So a number of these videos were dedicated to those fighters who were quote unquote martyred fighting for the Shiite, in this case a saint or a holy figure, Sayyidah Zainab, the sister of the third Shiite Imam Hussein and the daughter of Imam Ali, the first Imam. One of the videos includes a sort of a funeral prayer for several fighters who were martyred fighting in Syria, and it's purportedly the video was recorded inside the Zainab's shrine in Damascus. The first major Shiite militia operating in the country called itself the Brigade of Abu Fadl al-Abbas. Who was Abu Fadl al-Abbas? He was the half-brother of Imam Hussein. He was also his standard bearer at Karbala, in 680 CE when they both were slain. This is Abbas, this figure. This is the liwa, the banner. The Arabic name that they use is Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas. So the term liwa can mean, in this case it means a brigade. An alternate spelling, at least in writing, name of the brigade is Katibat Liwa, which then puts the emphasis on the liwa back on the banner. And this is something that they emphasize. And this is very, if we take out the more contemporary kind of artwork, take all of these pulling fatigues out, but you have, and maybe the shrine, but this figure, if you look at popular Ashura artwork, Muharram artwork, Shiite artwork, having nothing to do with militancy, that are Ashura this year, I guess is in November. I think it's in November. You will have images, if you look up, go on Google Images and look up Abbas, al-Abbas, you will find images that look like this of him. Many of them actually show his face because it's a very popular form of Shiite artwork, contemporary 12er Shiite artwork. So in this design, they've taken a very traditional image, the Abbas on the horse with the banner. It wouldn't say Labayk ya Zainab probably in a traditional kind of Muharram poster. They've added what actually, come to think of it, I think is actually a part of an actual photograph with these militiamen behind her, or behind him rather. We have Sayyidah Zainab's shrine in the background. The sky is kind of in the original image, it's kind of a blood red. There's a story about the sky, the weeping blood, the day of Hussein's martyrdom. So this is the kind of imagery and the rhetoric which is used, and the idioms which they draw from in terms of making their case for recruitment, of fighters. So there are various other organizations who are active, which are active in sort of Shiite organizations which are active in Syria. They take their names after other Shiite holy figures, sort of saintly figures. These include the Ali Akbar Brigade, the Brigade of the Awaited Savior, the Katibat al-Mahdi al-Muntazar, which refers to the 12th Imam, who 12er Shiites believe is in this kind of mystical hiding, I guess, to describe it, occultation. He's here, but he's not here. I mean, he's here, but he's not approachable. Nobody can reach him at a time appointed, divinely appointed. He will return and usher in this period of absolute justice, and he will punish, punish those who were, wicked, and reward those who were his true followers. So it's very similar to other kind of messianic beliefs. So there's a brigade named after him, another named after Al-Qasim, the nephew of Imam Hussein, and one of the martyrs of Karbala, and two brigades named after supporters of Imam Ali, Malik al-Ashtar and Amr bin Yasir. And I'll talk about them a little bit in just a moment. So the exact number in terms of the numbers of Shiite fighters is not known. The evidence is not clear. In October, an interview in October, one of the the al-Abbas brigade commanders, Abu Ajib, who was an Iraqi refugee living in Syria before the outbreak of the uprising, said that the group had about 500 fighters at that time. And then he also said in another interview, another anonymous brigade official said that there were the Abbas brigade was then subdivided into a number of units, many of whom were named after the Imam. So they're units named after Imam Hussein and others. The majority of the fighters seem to have come from Iraq, sent by Iraqi or recruited by Iraqi Shiite parties and militias, many of them allied to Iran. These include the one I mentioned before, Asad al-Haq, the League of the Righteous, as well as Kata'ib Hizbullah, the Hizbullah brigades, which is a militia which fought the Americans when they were there, and now it's still in existence. And also the sort of newer groups, one which calls itself Kata'ib Sayyid al-Shuhada, which was a breakaway faction of the Hezbollah brigades, and it makes reference to a title, an honorific title of Imam Hussein, the Sayyid al-Shuhada, the Prince of the Martyrs, or the Lord of the Martyrs, as well as another movement, Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, the Hezbollah movement of the most exemplary persons. Most of them are based in southern Iraq, sort of the Shiite sort of strongholds, and they've been holding public funerals for fighters killed in Iraq. And as sort of from the spring onward, they've become more, less and less ambiguous about where these people had been killed. Before they didn't say where, they were killed. They were killed as martyrs. Where were they killed? Well, we're not going to say. But it seemed from the iconography, from, the dome of the shrine, for example, that they were killed, or, defense of the holy places. I mean, there are many holy places, Shiite holy places in Iraq, but they probably were not, fighting there. So this is this is what's known in terms of the sort of hard numbers. It's kind of debated. There are some claims for harder numbers, but I don't find them as reliable. I think that the evidence, the open source evidence at least, is kind of wanting. Sort of just as a final closing note before I go back to the images, I just wanted a note about the sort of importance among the Shiite community on the Shiite side, 12er Shiite side, of the mobilization of the militias. There has been a growing debate among Shiite jurists about how exactly to handle this mobilization. Do you legitimize it as jihad, or do you legitimize it as some other form of kind of sanctified fighting, or do you not really talk about it? Sistani and those in Iraq have not really addressed it. There have been reports that they have sort of indirectly said that they oppose this kind of activity, which would make sense given their histories, and I'll come back to that in a moment. There are others, including one, a prominent mujtahid in Iraqi but based in Qom, named Qadim Ha'iri, who was another student of Sadiq Sadr's. Recently, he didn't come out and say this independently. It was in response to a question that he was sent. He did say that it was permissible to go to Syria to fight. I can't remember if he used the term jihad, but he did say it is permissible to go and fight. People like Qasim al-Ta'i, this engineer mujtahid that I talked about before, have been much less ambiguous in saying, yes, it is jihad, and yes, you can go and fight. And the Iranian government, through Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, have been more kind of, ambiguous about their support, and not as public about it, but, they have, supported it financially and sort of rhetorically. If you look at, from Press TV to Fars News to any of the kind of media outlets which are owned in part by the Islamic sort of Republic Broadcasting Agency, I think is the name of it. They have been very unambiguous about kind of the way that they portray these things. Something about Sistani's background is that in 2006, some of you may remember that the very important Shiite shrine in Samarra, that of the Askariya Mosque, the burial place of 2 of the 12 Imams, was blown up by al-Qaeda in Iraq, the dome of it. And then it was attacked later in 2007. Again, it was blown up again. At the time of the original attack in 2006, Sistani unambiguously said in his official statement that to Iraqi Shiites that there should not be any kind of retaliation, there should not be any kind of revenge. He said it again on the anniversary a year later, and then again later that year, I believe it was in June or July, I think, of 2007, when there was another bombing, more minor than the first. He repeated his position. However, as you might also remember that the fact, and this was the position taken by the other 3 Grand Ayatollahs in Najaf as well, the sort of the most senior of the resident Iraqi 12er Shiite, or not Iraqi, but Shiite jurists in Iraq, but their positions didn't stop sort of the devolution, right, of this kind of sectarian, very severe sectarian Sunni Shiite fighting, which occurred in 2006, 2007, 2008, and is, right, unfortunately, is continuing today, right? There are bombings every week, it seems. So I think that raises the question of, yes, they're very important, people like Ali Sistani, Grand Ayatollah Sistani, but their power is not absolute, and it's being challenged by more activist kind of rhetoric. And in certain times, in sort of times of conflict and civil war, in 2006, 2007 in Iraq, that it's not always the most learned who are going to come out on top. Then that's just in, before I guess to go in Q&A, just the images. We've talked about this one. And basically the text says, with our blood we write our love for Abbas, and with our martyrdom, bishahidatina, we mark or we trace our defense of Zainab, right? And it's interesting that sometimes you'll see her shrine, so like Marakat Zainab, but here they're talking about her as a person. This is just an interesting thing because there's a kind of gendering kind of thing with her, like she's a saint, but she's still gendered in a way that she's a woman and she needs defense. That's sort of as developed as my thinking of that has gone at the moment. But these are just some examples of the kinds of posters or the banners which are carried at the at the processions. If we look at the sort of upper left hand, we'll see Ali Khamenei, the Iraqi supreme leader, picture of the martyr on the right. This is the al-Asad logo. Labayk ya Zainab, O Zainab, just basically just says that he was killed defending her shrine. He's called the happy, the joyful martyr, Shahid al-Sa'id, and then the date of his death. It's another example. This is, on the left is Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadiq, picture of the martyr, Asad al-Ahl al-Haq's logo at the top, his name, and then this phrase when it's recited by Muslims when people die, which is basically that from God we've come and to God we return. This is a Shiite fighter. It was only named the text which accompanied the photo on the site where I found it. It was just Mahdi from Hama. He's holding a banner of Hussein. This is an example of the kind of popular Muharram kind of portrait sort of art that I was talking about, which is an on sort of, and also we see in the language Katibat Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas. So this is one of the examples of this alternate sort of name for the al-Abbas brigade. So I mean, this is, the images I think are not ambiguous at all. The language is basically, we have this term nawasib. So basically to the nawasib, those basically those who hate the family of the Prophet, right? This is a sort of derogatory term that Shiites use, some Shiites use for those who they accuse of hating the family of the Prophet, particularly Salafis. We warn you that we are the descendants of Haydar, which is one of the titles of Ali, lion, and you are the descendants of Amr bin al-As, I think Amr is the spell, I think, and Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan, who are these two historical figures who are revered by Sunnis, but really quite detested by Shiites. And in some cases, the artwork of these masked, fighters with, in this case, an RPG, have been literally taken from Sunni jihadi artwork and retooled. So here we have, no, I don't even think they've changed it, but sometimes instead of saying just something, the shahada, they'll put Labayk ya Zainab. So this is one of the examples. They've just taken it from another poster and stuck it in this one. This is an image. How many of you seen Mustafa Akkad's famous film, The Message? Excellent film with Anthony Quinn, this guy. So Anthony Quinn plays Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, who was one of the Prophet's uncles, also one of the sort of greatest warriors of early Islam. According to some historical accounts, one of the Prophet's most vitriolic critics, Hind, was so incensed that Hamza was so integral to the victory of the Muslims at the Battle of Badr, that at the following battle, the Battle of Uhud, she hired this Ethiopian or Abyssinian, or I don't know where he was from, but this African, basically, black African, sub-Saharan African mercenary only to kill Hamza. And then once Hamza was killed, she cut out his liver and she ate it as this kind of symbolic, act of cannibalism. So in this image, we were told that while some people stick closely to their traditions and their practices, and this, I don't know if many of you probably remember reading about this video of a Syrian rebel commander, actually the commander of the Brigade of Islam, Liwa al-Islam, where he had himself filmed cutting out some organ of a dead Syrian soldier and eating it, or not eating it, but taking this kind of symbolic bite and then reciting this kind of sort of political message, right? And then he later denied that he did it, and then there was a question of he couldn't remember which organ it was. But anyway, it's interesting. So we have something from 1400 years ago, which is this reported incident of Hind bin Utbah eating Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib's liver, or taking a bite of it, and then comparing it to this guy Abu Saqr, the rebel commander. I mean, this is the kind of depths to which they've gone, and it's similar to this kind of the Safavid reference against the Shiites or the Majus. I mean, that they're the fire worshippers from pre-Islamic Iran. These are two contrasting images. This is a Sunni one, and Al-Kata'ib is the media organization of al-Shabab in Somalia. So what does it say? أين أحفاد خالد بن الوليد لنصرة أهلنا في الشام? So where are the descendants of Khalid bin al-Walid, the great Muslim commander, military commander, sort of companion of the Prophet, again revered by Sunnis and really detested by Shiites? I think he was also involved in Fadak. I think he was Khalid bin Walid and Omar, I think, or he was, they don't like him. So bottom line. So, but there are variations of this. So if we went to Al-Qaeda Central, we went to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, well, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, we would have variations of this kind of thing. When the various cartoons of the Prophet came out, they would have something about where are the descendants of some prominent historical figure in defense of their Prophet? Where are the Muslims in defense of the Prophet? Where are those who assassinated, like the poets who insulted the Prophet? Here we have the Shiites, sort of equivalent of sort of name dropping, if you will, a historical figure, that of Ali, the first Imam, and spelling his name in bullets, which is sort of unorthodox. And there's more than one version of this photo, of this practice. Some of them spell Zainab in bullets, and these are two Shiite images, sort of internet artwork. One of them is this one. So we have the shrine of Zainab's shrine near Damascus, a grenade, of course, and this headband, which says essentially that with our souls we sacrifice for you. That's sort of implied, for you, Zainab. And here again, this idea of sacrifice for Zainab. This is a Hizbullah funeral, and then the shrine, the dome of the shrine in the background. This is a photograph, wanted for justice, like a wanted poster that was posted online. These individuals supposedly are from the group that destroyed the shrine of Hujr bin Adi al-Kindi from Liwa al-Islam, the Brigade of Islam, and down here it just sort of describes them as terrorists from Liwa al-Islam, who were destroyed basically the tomb of the Sahabi, of the companion of the Prophet and in support of Ali Hujr bin Adi. And there's later they did purportedly caught one of them, and they executed him, and they photographed that as well. These are stills from Jabhat al-Nusra videos. Here we have one of the martyrs, this is what they call themselves, the Istishhadi. And also it describes him as Qahar al-Nusayriya, the destroyer of the Nusayris, the Alawis. Jabhat al-Nusra, among other things, has been the group that has carried out, if not almost all of the the martyrdom operations, Amaliyat Istishhadiyya, this is what they call them, in Syria. This is one of them. They film them too. They're very savvy at filming them. And this is one of the sort of pieces of evidence of the ties between Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or the Islamic State of Iraq, and Jabhat al-Nusra. That right out of the gate, Jabhat al-Nusra's media apparatus, which they call al-Manara al-Bayda, the white minaret, which is a reference to one of the minarets in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, was very, very sort of high quality and very sort of professional. And this, you can see even, I think, from the sort of the stills. These are also from Jabhat al-Nusra videos. So we sacrifice for Sharia, our version of Sharia. This is the Jabhat al-Nusra flag at the top. And should you wish to follow them on Twitter, you can. They have a Facebook page, they have a Twitter page, they have blog, other things. This is another still from one of the martyrs, Abu Islam. May God accept him. This is from the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham. They declared an Islamic emirate in one of the cities, Jarablus, and this is from the child, I think, reciting the adhan, the call to prayer, or it says, no, Allahu Akbar, yeah, so the takbir. This is the flag. We see the kind of part of the flag, and we see part of the name of the Dawlat al-Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Sham. This is a teaching circle, stills from videos of a teaching, a Quranic sort of memorization circle. for children. And you see they're wearing these banners with the sort of infamous, this logo that the Islamic State uses. This is a dawah event, a missionary event, a tent basically. They've held a series of these, the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham in northern cities. So this was from Aleppo. There are various speakers. I think the man in glasses, I believe, is a Yemeni. They interviewed children. They've interviewed, people, children with disabilities, a boy with Down syndrome, even in one of these events, like a crippled, man, a little girl, actually, in the most recent video. This is the image about how the differentiation, I think it captures it very well. This is a still from a video which was just released very recently. So we have an Islamic State of Iraq and Asham fighter. And earlier in the video, they labeled themselves the Lions of Al-Anbar, the province of Anbar. They pull over 3 trucks driven, what they say are from the Rafida government or the Safavid government in Iraq to the Nusayris in Syria. And they start asking them questions. This is one of them. So he's asking it the same question another time. How many raka'ats, these kind of not steps, but procedures, ritual performances in the prayer, how many of them are in Salat al-Fajr, the morning, the sort of dawn prayer? There are 2. The answer is 2. He says 5. They ask him other things. How many are in this? And then they highlight the answer and they put an exclamation point. And why are they asking them these questions? They're asking them these questions and at the end they say, oh look, because they're Nusayris and they don't know. Because they're not Muslims, they don't know how many rakats are in the prayers. And then, the video, it culminates and they drag them to the side of the road and they shoot them. This guy, the same man, this man. But this, I think the text captures what I'm talking about in terms of how these kinds of things come to the forefront. So really what it's political, yeah, because it's basically they're accusing them of going and bringing, military supplies and other such things to the Syrian regime. But then they add in all of the questions they ask are not about their political positions, not about other things. It's all of the questioning is about the prayer. How many rakats are in this prayer? How many, the other one is Zuhr, I think. How many rakats are in, Salat al-Zuhr, and like 5. And they put like 5. He said there are 5, or he said 2. And this is, I think it captures it well. And with that, I will close. Any questions, if there are any? Thank you for your patience. Thank you.